Russia is losing the war in Ukraine. After nearly 3 full years of heavy fighting, Russia is dealing with military and economic losses that its political establishment is having a really hard time keeping up with, and this spells danger for Putin moving forward past 2025 and beyond. Let's take a deeper analysis of this. And we're not just going to be reading off their losses and saying, well, that's it, that's why they're going to lose. There's data behind each number. It's one thing to read off a number of, those killed and wounded in action, or a number of destroyed tanks in this conflict. It's a whole other thing to understand the impact and the underlying issues that comes behind those numbers and really why those numbers matter at all. And what does all of this mean for Russia in the end? So first, we're going to discuss Russia's losses in Ukraine, but then we're going to discuss the underlying meaning behind those numbers. What is the so what behind it? And while the losses themselves are often discussed publicly, the insights behind these losses is often ignored or overlooked. So before we dive into the losses, let's do a quick history on this war and really how the Russian military has undergone a wartime evolution and what exactly that signals for the military today and how they're looking to move forward into the future, and really why the end of this war might be sooner than people might be thinking. At the start of this war, Russia's military was considered to be a near peer to the United States. It was not only due to its size, but also to its capabilities, wartime experience, and professionalism. Russia's military pre-war had between 900,000 to 1 million active duty personnel across the different services and about 2 million reservists. However, that number hides a key characteristic of the personnel that made up the Russian military. Russia still has a conscription system, meaning that men past the age of 18 may be drafted involuntarily into the military, whether they really want to join or not. However, there are legal protections for these troops. The whole idea behind conscription is to really train these individuals up, get them to a unit, and then really transition them into the reserves or inactive service so they can be called up later in wartime. However, during their active duty time, they are often used in support and sustainment roles, not in combat roles, and they legally cannot be used outside of Russian borders unless, of course, during wartime. 25 to 30% of Russia's pre-war military, which was about 270,000 Russian troops, were active duty conscript soldiers. The remaining 70 to 75%, or about 410,000 troops, were all contract soldiers, meaning that they could be used abroad and in combat duties. Now we're going to talk about why this is relevant here in just a little bit, but keep that data in mind. In terms of equipment, pre-war, Russia had the largest armored fleet in the world, with over 12,000 main battle tanks, whether they were of the T-72, the T-80, or the more modern T-90 variety. They also had over 13,000 infantry fighting vehicles, or IFVs, of the BMP or the airborne BMD variety. They also had around 7,000 armored personnel carriers, or of the BTR series. In terms of artillery, they had about 6,500 self-propelled systems, with about 4,500 towed artillery systems in active duty service, as well as several multiple rocket launch systems. To back both of these numbers up, Russia also had what was colloquially referred to as a Soviet inheritance. During the Cold War, Russia built a ton of armored vehicles and tanks that were retired and basically transitioned over to scrap yards. Either they were kept in storage or they were cannibalized and used for newer systems. And so pre-war, Russia had multiple different armored parks just chock full of old tanks, old APCs, old IFVs that in the time of war they could pull out. They'll have to, modernize it, put more modern equipment on it, make sure that it runs okay, but then they could transfer to active duty. Of course, throughout the war, that's exactly what they've done, but we'll talk more about that as well here in a moment. Overall, it's important to keep track of why they have such a massive ground force and why they have so many tanks. It's because the Russian doctrine really followed Soviet doctrine for quite a long time, which really emphasized mass armored formations, pushing forward under the cover of significant artillery strikes, a lot of airstrikes, to kind of clear a path for the armored force to take a lot of ground. Conceptually, it was a slow formation, but it was incredibly heavy, and it would be able to capture a lot of ground over time, not necessarily in kind of a lightning strike or very mobile way. That, of course, takes us to their Air Force. And while the emphasis was on the ground, there's certainly no slouches in the air. Pre-war, they had the second largest Air Force in the world, with just under 1,000 fighter aircraft of different varieties. They, of course, were working on fifth-generation aircraft that, according to a lot of air experts, of which I am not one, their fifth-generation Sukhoi 57 was not exactly up to par as other, like American, for example, fifth-generation fighters like the F-22 or the F-35. However, However, it still shows that Russia is attempting to maintain a modern air force with increased capabilities, and they're really trying to stay in the race. The majority of their fighter aircraft, however, are older Soviet systems, with about 350 airframes being made up of more modern, as in early 2010s era Su-30, 34s, and 35s. Russia also has a series of bombers that are both nuclear and conventional capable, but for our purposes capable of launching cruise missiles and other kinds of larger ordnance, with the Tu-95, the Tu-160, or the Tu-22M. For close air support, you also have Russia's helicopter suite. Around 400 pre-war existed, with the key systems being the old classic, the Mi-24, as well as newer systems like the Mi-28 or the Ka-52. Russia also has a significant transport helicopter fleet, which allows them to air assault VDV forces into an area in kind of a rapid attack style. And this kind of takes us to a more reformed kind of Russian doctrine that we're going to talk about in about 5 seconds. But before we hit that, let's hit on Russian air defense. Russia pre-war had a very large, and they still today have a very large and advanced suite of air defense, with the closer in protection systems being like the Pantsir, the Buk, the Tunguska, and then larger long-range strategic systems being like the S-300, the S-400, or even the future generation of the S-500. Now, I've already mentioned what their older kind of doctrine used to be. They've been transitioning their doctrine over the past 10 to 15 years into a lighter, faster attack model. And this is what really led to the perception that they were becoming increasingly more modern and increasingly more professional. Instead of a heavier ground attack, they would air assault VDV forces with transport helicopters and with gunships to a specific area like an airfield. Once they had captured the airfield, the plan would be to launch larger transport aircraft to land at that airfield with heavier equipment, continue to expand the foothold, all the while a larger armored force would stream across the border and reach that airfield for a more sustained presence and increased logistical support. However, although through these reforms they did gain the reputation of becoming a more professional and trained force, reputations are slowly gained but very quickly lost. Early in the war, Russia put this doctrine to the test, and they suffered incredibly heavy casualties. For example, and this is really where we can see this doctrine in play, was with Kiev, where the VDV attempted to take the hostile airport, which they succeeded. However, they were quickly placed under artillery attack, and they began to suffer heavy casualties. Because of the contested airspace, and because Russia was unable to secure the airspace, especially around Kiev, with Ukrainian air defenses destroying a number of Russian aircraft, they were not able to send the Il-76 aircraft with heavier equipment that was originally planned. And so the VDV around Hostomel Airport had to dig in and hold until the ground attack coming in from Belarus could relink with them. And while they did do that, and they were able to provide, more logistical support to those forces, they ultimately ran out of logistical sustainment due to poor planning and poor to just general force structure, and then they were forced to retreat from Kiev. And this whole situation was even more catastrophic for the armored formations pushing westward from Sumy Oblast. It also didn't help that the air assault itself was heavily attrited before it even arrived due to, again, a dense amount of Ukrainian short-range air defense systems. This is also exacerbated by some key legal issues with Russia, and again, we've already talked about how their conscript troops cannot be used abroad. So in this case, Russia had to rely even more heavily on contract troops for this attack. Conscript troops could not cross the border to help out the contract troops. Instead, they had to stay in Russia and logistically sustain the attack, but once support had to get across the border and get even deeper into Ukraine, it was all on the contract troops from there. This is all because instead of declaring war on Ukraine, Putin declared this to be a special military operation. This meant that he could safeguard his political position and really insulate himself from the fallout of this war and prevent any kind of the fallout from this war going sideways for himself, while at the same time he wouldn't be able to enjoy some of the legal powers that he would get if he were in war. Russia has had to rely on contract troops, and it still to this day has to rely on contract troops. At the start of this war, a lot of the contract troops were patriots for Russia. They were ideologically aligned with what Russia wanted to do. They felt like they were doing some sort of a public service, and so they weren't necessarily joining for the money. As the war has ran on, though, a lot of those contract personnel have been killed or wounded, and the overall force composition began to change away from these kinds of individuals. By the end of 2022, 100,000 Russian troops had been killed or wounded. By the end of 2023, that number swelled to over 360 troops killed and wounded. And by the end of 2024, that number is now over 800,000. Now, these are very big numbers, but what exactly does that mean? Remember that pre-war, Russia had around 410,000 active duty contract personnel in the army. With over 800,000 troops killed or wounded since the start of the war, Russia could could have had their active duty component basically completely lost, recruited a replacement wave that itself was also completely lost, and then recruited yet another wave, and then that's what they're fighting with today. Now, of course, that's not exactly how that happens. There are, of course, soldiers that have managed to survive throughout the entirety of this war. However, it is indeed true that much of their contract personnel at the start of the war have been attrited. And the overall quality of the recruits and the quality of the training regimen that is provided for those troops has gone down significantly since the war began. And again, Russia cannot use conscript troops where the fighting is the heaviest. So this population that has been already heavily impacted and decimated by this war is continuing to get hit with the brunt of the fighting. Russia did have some rounds of mobilization. However, they were in increments, and Putin has decided not to do another round of mobilization. We're going to talk about why that is and what the political risks to him are here in just a moment. However, instead of doing another round of mobilization, Russia has had to recruit troops with other kinds of means, whether that's by offering significant paychecks, bonuses, and salaries, or by recruiting foreigners. And this has cost Russia just a ton of money, and then we're going to talk about that here in the economic section of this video. All told, 2024 was a record year for Russia in all the worst ways. They were able to gain more territory. They increased the pace of their operations, and they were able to gain more territory throughout eastern Ukraine. However, to do that, they had to incur a significant cost that they did not have to sustain in previous years. And even despite that, they did not, and they are not capable of exploiting any kind of breakthrough in the line where Ukraine is starting to break down. Just in 2024 alone, with all that progress, Russia suffered around 450,000 casualties, with about 158,000 of those casualties being killed. And this is according to reporting from Ukrainian General Sursky. Now, of note, whenever we talk about losses, I'm pulling data from what Ukraine is reporting. They do tend to overestimate casualties on the Russian side. However, they aren't that far apart from what Western sources also report, as well as what open source reporting has shared. To date, Russia has lost over 9,833 tanks, 20,477 armored vehicles. And note that whenever I say armored vehicles, that includes everything from BMPs to BMDs and APCs, but it also may include vehicles that are being pulled from scrapyards, from the Soviet inheritance that I mentioned before. So while you might be trying to square some of these numbers with the numbers I reported earlier, the reason that these might be a bit bigger is because they're including vehicles that were not reported because they were not in active duty service. Russia's also lost over 22,000 artillery systems, which includes both self-propelled and towed artillery from both active duty and scrapyards, as well as 369 planes. I want to note that those are not all just attack jets. Those include transport aircraft like, of course, IL-76s. They've also lost 331 helicopters. Again, not just gunships like what we've already talked about. They also include transport helicopters. They've also lost 28 ships, and some of these ships have been very large ships like the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, the Moskva, as well as the submarine, and some other pretty significant ships in the Black Sea Fleet that are very expensive, require some very advanced parts to create, and will take Russia a long time to replace those losses. They've also lost a significant amount of other types of equipment to include sustainment and support equipment that is also very niche, very expensive, and requires very advanced parts, including, AWACS aircraft and other things. Just to replace all the equipment that's been lost, Russia would have to invest between 25 to 40 billion US dollars and dedicate about 5 to 10 years just to rebuild the equipment and material that they've lost. Never mind any new systems they may feel that they need to buy or might be good investments, knowing what they know now coming out of this conflict. And all of that said, there's no way to get the hundreds of thousands of soldiers that they've lost since the beginning of the war, whether killed or wounded. No amount of money will be able to replace the lost husbands, fathers, sons, and brothers that have been killed in this conflict. That said, there kind of is a way for them to replace these losses, and that is with money. Or at least that's the deal that the Ministry of Defense is really trying to strike with Russian people. For $2,000 to $3,000 a month in terms of salary, as well as a very hefty signing bonus of tens of thousands of dollars, Russia is trying to recruit citizens to join its military and do so as a way and incentivize them to joining military service by transforming their lives financially. Just a salary of $2,000 to $3,000 US dollars really jumps them into the top 10 to 15% of Russian salaries across the country. So it doesn't sound like a lot of money in the United States because it's not in the United States. It is a lot of money to Russians. And this is leading to one significant issue within the Russian economy and within Russia's defense expenditure. This practice is incredibly expensive and is incredibly widespread, and they are again implementing this to a growing extent across the country. Pre-war, Russia's defense budget was just below 6 $66 billion. In 2024, that is more than doubled to over $140 billion, which that figure now constitutes a third of the Russian government's total government expenditure. A significant portion of that defense budget that is astronomical is going straight to just salaries. This is also creating a bit of a race within Russia, where Russia will set a recruitment goal for each individual region. The regions begin to compete with one another to make their quota and to make their offer more attractive to meet that quota, and so that raises the cost of the offer for individual Russians as well. Of course, this is driving up the expenses for the Russian Ministry of Defense with increasing salaries, increasing signing bonuses, and this has forced the overall salary for Russian soldiers to increase by multiple times since this whole scheme was introduced. This is all incredibly expensive to Russia, but it's not particularly efficient. Russia is getting new recruits. In fact, they're getting just enough recruits to replace the losses that they're suffering month after month. However, the quality of these recruits, the quality of their training, and the motivation of these individual recruits is really becoming a significant problem for Russia. These soldiers are not like the ones that came before them. These folks are joining for money. They're joining because they want to change the financial trajectory of their families, and they're able to do so. However, they are taking on significant risk to themselves, whether it's life or limb. And with a very short training program of just a week or two before they are sent right into the front line, they are having extremely heavy casualties. In fact, recruits that sign the dotted line have about a month life expectancy from the moment they sign a new contract to the moment that they're either killed or wounded on the battlefield. Even if they're killed or wounded, it's still incredibly costly for Russia, because now at the point of death or at the point of injury, Russia has to pay the family of that service member either a one-time payment for their death or a one-time payment for their injury, depending on the severity of their injury. If the soldier is killed, the family receives a one-time payment of 7.4 million rubles, which is about $75,000. Taking 2024's loss data, Russia had to spend about $11.25 billion just on death payments to the families alone. And that's not accounting for the amount of individuals injured. For serious injuries, relatives should expect to receive about 3 million rubles. For moderate injuries, about 1 million rubles, and for minor injuries, about 100,000 rubles. For minor and moderate injuries, the soldier may also be able to stay in service, and so the Russian government's not just having to pay out the injury settlement, they're also having to pay out the salary for the soldier to continue to serve. This is incredibly rough math, and I'm going to do just a general average for the purpose of this video, so that way you can kind of contextualize the size of how much money is being spent here. So take this for what it is, but let's imagine every injury, every combat casualty that didn't result in death in 2024 resulted in a moderate injury. Not a severe injury, but also not a minor injury. At $10,000 per family per injury, that's about $3 billion spent by the Ministry of Defense just in last year alone. So whenever you pair this figure with the amount that Russia spent on deceased personnel payments to their families, Russia spent about $14.25 billion just this last year on one-time payments for families for soldiers that are not going to be re-entering service by and large. That is almost already a quarter of Russia's entire pre-war military budget. And we haven't even touched any of the active duty salaries, any of the existing contracts for new equipment, any, payments that might need to go into food and fuel for the military, any of that. This is just salaries going for soldiers that have been killed or wounded just last year. All of this is having a massive impact on Russia's economy and the government's ability to keep up. There have been reports that Russian families are having issues receiving their payments, whether it's due to bureaucratic issues that's preventing them from collecting their payments, or there being delays in their payments. Taking a look at the Russian economy, you begin to see exactly why some of this might be happening. Interest rates right now are pretty high. They're about 21%. For a comparison, US interest rates are about 4.5%. These are some of the highest interest rates that Putin has had since he took office back in 2000. And it's this high as the Russian central bank is attempting to wrangle inflation. And this is all due to increased and heavy spending. That increased spending has spun up to cover the costs of the war. So there's really not much of a way to decrease the amount of spending, because of course, as this war goes on, as Russia's problems begin to mount, they're throwing money at the issue. So the spending is increasing, then the inflation's increasing. And so the central bank up to this point has been trying to increase the interest rate to tamp down inflation, and that succeeded for a time. However, now that the interest rate has gotten up to about 20%, Vladimir Putin actually intervened and stated that he did not want to see the interest rate increase increase any further because that was causing all kinds of other secondary issues for the economy, specifically with lending. And so now the inflation rate may be able to just run away unabated with the interest rate not being able to be changed any higher. This may not seem like a reasonable decision by Putin until you take a deeper look at how the lending situation is going on in Russia. Following the start of the war in Ukraine, the Ministry of Defense started directing banks to make compulsory soft loans to defense-related corporations to cover some of their costs. These loans, however, are not included in Russia's defense budget. However, they have ballooned to the hundreds of billions of dollars, with one estimate showing between $210 and $250 billion in loans between contractors and other banks. Some analysts have stated that this might lead to a wave of bankruptcies across Russia at the end of 2025. However, I've seen others have differing opinions, and so I'll just let you take that for what it is. I'm not an economist. The heavy recruitment drive is also leading to an increased competition between the Ministry of Defense and, well, the Ministry of Defense. The Army needs more bodies in uniform, and so that's what's driving up their signing bonuses. However, defense contractors and their defense industrial base also need people to man the assembly line. And so the Army is competing with defense contractors in the private sector of the Ministry of Defense, really both trying to compete for the same kinds of individuals. People that are physically capable of either fighting in the war or working in the factory. This, of course, is leading to increased levels of spending, which, of course, is driving up further inflation. This also has impacts to the private sector pool as well. With increased salaries mean increased wealth for the poor in Russia. So if there's any silver lining here at all, it's that at least the poor in Russia are having their lives changed here. They're able to actually get money and change the financial trajectory of their family. However, all of that, of course, as well, comes with increased levels of spending, and this scaled up across the country is also leading to increased inflation. Like I already said, I'm no economist, but just looking at this situation, it really looks like the Russian economy is racing towards a heat death, where because of the unpopularity of increased interest rates, Russia is basically allowing the inflation to run away unabated and really just kind of crossing their fingers and hoping that they can win the war before the economy collapses in on itself. And so it's a race to see which collapses first, the Ukrainian government and military or the Russian economy. So overall, Russia is having to spend an astronomical amount of money to cover wartime expenses and maintain its current military, never mind the future costs that it will have to spend just to rebuild its military once this war is over. And they can't exactly abandon the high salary recruitment system either. Like I've already said, Putin has already initiated a couple rounds of mobilization. These proved to be incredibly politically controversial and are now incredibly politically risky for Putin. In fact, all of this is becoming more and more risky for Putin. At the start of the war, Putin promised the Russian people that this would be a quick and easy war to flip the Ukrainian government back to a pro-Russian stance, and it wouldn't be that bad. These were, of course, maximalist war aims. However, in Putin's mind, he was going to have a pretty easy time getting to Kiev, flipping the government, and Russia wouldn't have to sustain any kind of heavy losses before the government had been flipped. This war obviously has not at all gone how he anticipated, with us very fastly approaching 3 full years of fighting since the war began, and the government in Kiev remains exactly as it was before. Putin has tried a couple rounds of mobilizations, like I said, to cover the losses from this war and to get more bodies on the cheap. However, this led to increased political protests throughout Russia, especially in Moscow and St. Petersburg, where Putin's political base tends to reside, and that also significantly impacted the oligarchy. And so that has led to increased risk for Putin that the oligarchs might actually lose patience with Putin and turn on him, especially if a third mobilization took place. And so Putin has had to avoid having another round of mobilization while still having to find ways to get a massive amount of bodies in uniform to continue on with the war. And so this has led to him recruiting from prisons, recruiting from abroad, recruiting with massive paychecks, and now apparently recruiting other soldiers from other countries. Anything that can avoid having to have another round of mobilization. However, despite all of that, Putin still cannot compromise on the promises that he made to the Russian people. The whole point, the reason that he has cost Russian families so much heartache from either losing family, the loss of property in some parts of Russia, the economic impact to Russia, the loss of its standing, and we're going to talk about that here in a second, has been to flip the government in Ukraine. And even if Russia stops right now, they will have gained some additional territory. They'll have secured a land bridge to Crimea, which is important, but it's not what Putin promised. Only a total victory in Ukraine will be sufficient. And it's increasingly visible that Putin is going to try to pursue this at any cost. And this, of course, has led to the cost of increased reliance on China. Of course, before the war, Russia and China attempted to pursue this relationship as peers, and Russia could afford to do so because, of course, course, it had a strong military and a very robust economy. Its economy is still, of course, robust. It's just very different, and it's entirely focused on the war. The relationship, however, since the start of the war has become increasingly less equal, and less so a partnership among like-minded and equal partners, and more a system of economic dependency from Russia to China, where Russia is the dependent and China's basically Russia's sugar daddy. Western sanctions have also pushed Putin even further into China's arms, and while China is definitely not wanting to get any of those secondary sanctions, they're willing to give Putin a helping hand, albeit at significant discounts. From 2023 to 2024, Chinese co-ownership in Russian companies grew by 32%. The share of Chinese businesses among new business registration in Russia grew from just 13% in 2021 to over 34% in 2024. China's also been able to receive significant discounts on Russian natural gas, and this has kept the Russian energy sector afloat, albeit at a 35% lower cost to China per 1,000 cubic meters of natural gas than what Russia sells to Europe. Again, this is not exactly the type of relationship that Putin had envisioned between Russia and China 4 years ago. And this is certainly not a bad deal for China. Of course, this is leading to growing social and political anxiety in Russia and around Putin that Russia is losing its global position for this war, and they're having to accept more and more unfavorable terms for simple deals that it used to get fairly easily just 4 years ago. All that takes us to a public poll here, and there are a lot of reasons not to trust public polling in Russia. Of course, heavy censorship might impact some of these polls, and the risks to those polled if they give kind of quote unquote the wrong answer, that might come with fines or even jail time, but it's all we have, and so that's what we're going to have to run with. Also consider that Russia has a closed information space, so they might be giving their honest answer based on the information they've received. They've just received a tailored kind of information that really shapes a particular narrative. They do, of course, obviously have access to other means of information through VPNs like to YouTube and other apps. However, that by and large is among younger people. Middle-aged and older Russians still by and large receive their information from television. And this has taken us to one poll that showed that the average level of support for the war is somewhere between 60 and 70%, even still in 2024. So while Putin still has large social support for the war in Ukraine, and he has taken that to mean a political mandate to achieve the maximalist objectives, he's running out of time. We've already discussed how the economic clock is ticking, and it might be closer to midnight than perhaps anybody's really thinking. For all that time, effort, the losses, and the costs from this war, what exactly have they achieved? Of course, like I've already said, they've gained some territory in Ukraine. They've got that ground corridor to Crimea. However, they've also lost territory in Russia proper in Kursk. They become greatly economically dependent on China and even more internationally isolated than they had been even at times during the Cold War. They've tethered their economy to a war that really cannot go on forever, and really the only way that this economy can continue to function is with the war. However, the war is continuing to overheat the economy to the point that it cannot sustain the war that much longer. They've also established the conditions that this economy could overheat because of the war, and that could lead to a financial crisis. And with all that being said, they are still a long way from Kiev. The government in Kiev, the democratically elected government in Kiev, continues to function as usual. And there's even a long post-war recovery period ahead for Russia, even once all of this is over. And there are even more costs beneath the surface that we in the open information space really may not even register just yet. All Russia had to do was completely flip the government system in Kiev, something that is inherently incredibly difficult to do. All Ukraine had to do is survive. Nearly 3 full years into this conflict, Russia is no closer to flipping the government in Kiev, and Ukraine has in fact survived. With its growing list of problems, it really appears that Russia is on a bit of a track to lose this conflict unless, some sort of a magic wand can be waved and their economy can be fixed. But they certainly have a number of faster paths towards an economic or military collapse than they do towards military victory. But with all that said, I want to hear your thoughts. So comment your thoughts about all of this down below in the comments. Let's continue this conversation. Like this video if you found it to be helpful or informative. It helps this video reach new audiences and helps grow this channel, and I really appreciate it. Also, thank you to those of you that watched my Greenland video. That did fairly well. I really appreciate seeing you guys talking about that down in the comments. There were some really good discussions. I was very happy to see that it was for the most part very civil, and that's exactly why I make these videos. So that was very encouraging for me to see, and I wanted to thank you for that. So yeah, leave a like, comment your thoughts. Let's continue the conversation just the same with this video, and subscribe for more analysis not only on this conflict but on other defense related topics. With all that, I'll see y'all next time. Later.